Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pop Crime TV's The Outlier podcast. I am really excited today because I've got a very special guest, a fellow creator, podcaster, host. She's incredible. She's Celisia Stanton, the host of Tenderfoot TV's Truer Crime and The Vanishing Point. And I must say, those are two of the most compelling podcasts out there. And Celisia has a big hand in that. So, unlike your typical true crime show, Truer Crime challenges the traditional narratives, offering a more nuanced, ethical, and socially aware approach to crime storytelling. Because I've talked about this before. Sometimes it feels weird and it feels icky, and all we want to do is help and make people aware of certain crimes. So Celicia does a fantastic job of this. So I also want to add that her own experience as a crime victim, and she will get into this during the pandemic, has really given her a firsthand look at the justice system, and it's changed the way that she has viewed crime stories in general. So let's make me stop talking now. I have a habit of going on and on. You guys all know this, so I'm going to shut up and I'm going to bring in our special guest, Celisia Stanton.
Hi.
Hi, Celisia. How are
Hi,
you?
I'm super excited to be here. I'm doing good.
I'm so excited to have you. Before I get into truer crime, because I'm very excited to discuss some of the episodes and some of the cases you have this season, can you give everybody an idea of what happened to you in 2020 and what actually changed your perception of the justice system?
Yeah, so it's kind of a little bit of a long story, but I was working as a wedding and portrait photographer for years, kind of just right out of college, actually. And ultimately, in during 2020, obviously with the pandemic, there wasn't a lot of things and events going on, so I had a lot more free time and was doing a lot of work on social media. Actually, after the murder of George Floyd, I live in Minneapolis, and so that was just something that was obviously very close to home and something I was pretty involved with in terms of kind of the subsequent uprising. So I started doing some work around social and racial justice education that really was resonating with people on Instagram, and just kind of, different swipe graphics and things like that I had made that went viral. And so I knew I wanted to do more work in that world of social and racial justice, but didn't know exactly what that was going to look like longer term, especially because I feel like, obviously social media is so black and white, and oftentimes it can be pretty unnuanced. And I feel like with the kind of person that I am, I really appreciate a more long form, nuanced approach to storytelling and discussions and conversations and all of that. So that was kind of in the back of my mind at that year. And then later that summer of 2020, I actually started working with this financial advisor, just kind of try to make plans for my future. As a self-employed person, I was like, I don't really know exactly how I'm going to retire or save for these big purchases, like, a house or kids or all of that. So I was excited to kind of work with somebody to figure those steps out. And so I had found a guy who was local. He was really well known in the community. He kind of had his own financial planning business. And he really had kind of told me that part of his approach is really trying to give people access to the sort of like financial space that typically are excluded, right? So think, Black folks or other, folks of color, women, small business owners. So that him as a Black man, that was really a part of his value system and kind of an importance to him, or held high importance to him. So we kind of really resonated. That really resonated with me, and we felt pretty like aligned. And so I was excited to kind of start working with him. And then, long story short, it turned out he was actually
Keep it long,
defrauding.
by the way. This is interesting. Don't worry about keeping
Yeah.
it short. I know it's a
Yes.
bit your speech, but go for it.
Yeah. Well, I found out that he was defrauding all of his investor clients. So he stole over $2 million from a number of people, all the folks that he was working with. And what's crazy too is that he was actually a fiduciary. He had the correct background to be a financial advisor. He had all of the training, the degrees, all of that. So like he had the means and the education to do this job like legitimately. He just chose not to, and was really using a lot of those funds for like personal things, like to go on cruises, or to buy nice cars, or things like that. So he legit turned himself into the FBI. He had been under investigation by the FBI, which interestingly too, I found out later that when I had started working with him in August of 2020, he was under investigation at that point, or maybe he was under investigation like directly after that, or like soon into us working together. But with them not having enough, I guess, to like pursue charges at that point, it like,
Mhm.
it didn't stop me from investing all this money with him, which is just kind of sad to think about in retrospect, because it's like, ugh, like they were on him and still I was working with him and giving him money.
So
And
you lost all your hard-earned money, and I mean, you're young too. Not
yeah,
saying like someone old, it's I mean, I just feel like when you're so young, you work so hard, and this is what you save for your future, and you
yeah.
lost it all?
Yeah, so it was like all of the savings that I had had up to that point, which especially being, a small business owner, that was like, everything. I didn't have really like other accounts set up that you might have, like a retirement account if you worked at like a traditional job or something like that. So yeah,
Wow.
it was really crazy. And so then I was kind of thrust into this whole like criminal legal process, right? As a
Wow.
victim, and him kind of having charges pressed against him, and he ultimately did end up pleading guilty, and he was sentenced to a prison term. That's actually where he is right now. He's serving that term. um but yeah, so it was a really just wild experience. And I mean, even to your point, like for me, I mean, I lost tens of thousands of dollars and that I invested with him, but there were other people who I did end up meeting throughout the process that had hundreds of thousands of dollars, their entire retirement. Like there was one family that I had developed a relationship with later, who they were kind of close to retirement age or at retirement age. It was their entire retirement. So I think it was like $300,000 to $500,000. And what was especially upsetting was that it was a couple, and the wife, her sister, had gotten early onset dementia and was in a long-term care facility. And so that's a huge financial burden, to have to figure
Mhm.
out care for that, for her sister, what she felt like could potentially be decades longer, because they had sort of longevity in their family, and because it was early onset, she could live for quite a long time. And so they had invested all of her money that she had made before she had gotten sick with him as well. So for them, that was especially devastating, because it was like everything, it wasn't just themselves, but they had entrusted him, with their family. And I think that was just what was really unsettling to me, is that he could literally meet with us, every other week
I was
or
I was thinking that, and
yeah,
not to interrupt you, but I'm thinking like, so this guy looked
yeah,
you in the eye.
right.
He sees your hopes and dreams, all of your aspirations, what you want to do with this money, how hard you've worked for it. He looks you in the eye, he meets with you knowingly, I'm assuming, knowing that he is going to just donk off this money for himself. And
Yeah.
you guys are going to, I'm so disgusted. It really is. It's horrible. And just thinking back about Bernie Madoff, I mean,
Mhm.
you heard about all the suicides after this.
Yeah.
It's people, it's their
Yeah.
life savings. They have nothing, and it's
Yeah.
devastating. I'm just curious, what kind of prison sentence did this guy get?
Yeah, so he was sentenced to about 7 years. He was not eligible parole, but I get sort of like victims notifications
Yeah.
emails, right? And so though that release date has kind of been pushed up and pushed up and pushed up. So I don't actually know how much time he is going to ultimately end up serving.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
he went into prison in the summer, early fall of 2021. So he's still kind of like in the beginning, middle part of that term. And
Okay.
actually, I just wanted to comment on one thing you had said earlier about Bernie Madoff and those
Mhm.
and the victims, and how so many of them, had all of these really terrible outcomes in terms of like suicide or other just, other mental health issues and things like that. And I just feel like that is something that's really important to highlight, because I think a lot of times when I tell this story, a lot of folks, especially because I am somebody who's in the true crime space now, and, telling true crime stories that are often about violent crime, there's this feeling that like, uh, we shouldn't have that much empathy for a victim of a financial crime because of the fact that, well, you made a stupid decision, or I wouldn't make those decisions if I was in the same position, or, that the long-term impacts of something like that aren't as serious as maybe if you were the victim of a violent crime. But the reality is like there is studies on this, the Bernie Madoff victims actually being some of the people that researchers have looked into, and the mental health impacts of experiencing a financial crime of this nature are really similar to the impacts you'll see from somebody who experiences violent crime. And I think it's kind of a similar thing when you're talking about people who are victims of cults or other things like that, where people kind of just feel like, well, your bad decision making maybe put you in this position, and therefore maybe there's just a little bit less of an understanding for what that might be like.
That's pretty shocking if you were met with any of that critique or criticism. I mean, I personally, you're meeting with a guy, like you said, has the credentials. What does this have to do with you making a wrong decision? That's actually pretty crazy. And it's violating as well. I would imagine it's very violating, and it's devastating. I'm sorry if that is how people see that. I am, because that really sucks. And also, I'm just curious, is he ordered to try to pay you guys back at any point, or how does that work?
Yeah, so he is, as a part of his sentence, he's ordered to pay reparations. So technically, he owes back all of the money that he stole. So that $2+ million. That's obviously very difficult for anybody to pay back, much less somebody who is in prison where, you're getting paid cents, often for the work that you're doing. So I don't have necessarily high hopes that I'll ever
Yeah.
recoup any large segment of that money. And then, I think one of the things that they did do after he was convicted, or after he pled guilty, they started this process, but it took a very long time. They were basically figuring out what assets could be liquidated to sort of recoup some of what was taken.
Right.
And so, but the problem is that, and a lot of times this is the case, he had spent this money on things that can't really be liquidated. So like services and experiences and all of that, right? And so then when they did end up getting whatever lump sum of money, and then that's actually divided evenly amongst all the victims, which, and from a perspective like me, someone who is younger and maybe lost less money than some other folks, it's like, okay, that's great. And I feel like I'm just as entitled as anybody else to get my money back. But then if you've lost, hundreds of thousands of dollars, I mean, honestly, the segment that I got of that money was just like so minuscule compared to like the amount that was stolen. So it's like even more of a drop in the bucket, obviously, for folks who lost even more money.
Absolutely.
But yeah, but technically, I think it's like gets paid out, when basically, because he pays into the system some percentage of his paycheck or whatever it might be, and then that gets paid out automatically to victims when it hits like maybe $50 or something like that.
Oh
So I haven't
no.
really seen a single check
Oh,
yet.
that is so crazy. I'm sorry. I mean, I feel like I don't want to I don't want to say anything positive or anything cliche to you, because I have not been in that situation, and it drives me crazy when someone's like, "Well, everything happens for a reason." It's like, "Bitch, why don't you try?" Like it's
Yeah.
awful. So, I am sorry, but however, I believe that this is what made you, I guess, interested in crime and in storytelling and podcasting, and you're very gifted at it. So, I mean, tell me about your segue getting into the Vanishing Point and Truer Crime. And I'm really excited, by the way, to talk about season 2 of Truer Crime, which just premiered, I believe, a few weeks ago, because you've got some great cases, some really well known cases. But yeah, tell me about your segue here into this.
Yeah. So for me, I think, I guess in the aftermath of being defrauded, I was like, this was now like December of 2020. And
Mhm.
so, holiday time, I live in Minnesota. It's freezing cold. Again, there's not a lot of events going on. It's the pandemic. So everyone's inside. So not a lot going on. And I literally was spending every day literally just doing cat puzzles and listening to true crime podcasts all day. Like, I don't know, it was like a weird sort of coping mechanism for me. And so I was constantly pausing the different shows that I was listening to and talking to my husband, who we both did debate together in high school. That's how we met. And then we both coached debate for 15 years. So we kind of like engaging with things in a critical
So
way.
cool. I
Yeah,
love
yeah,
that.
super
Cool.
fun. But so yeah, we love to debate things and talk about things in a deeper, critical way. And so that's kind of why it was just super natural for me to be like pausing it and sort of being like, oh my gosh, like I hate that, they're not talking about race or gender, or sexuality, or the root causes of crime, or, what crime really looks like and the people who are most typically victims. And I had all of these kind of concerns. And so I brought it up enough times that he was eventually like, why don't you just like start your own show? You seem to have all these ideas. And I was like, actually, that's a good one. So I went and I created True Crime. And so I think, to some extent, obviously, being the victim of this financial crime definitely was part of the reason that I ended up creating True Crime. But for me, it really was a part of a larger like tapestry of things and experiences in my life that led to it. I mentioned earlier the piece about this social and racial justice education that I was doing online, and how that was kind of resonating with people. And specifically, I think too, like kind of my approach being conversational, or just like, just approachable and accessible.
Yeah.
And then, but about issues that are maybe like hard for people to talk about. And then, so that this true crime was a way to do some of that work in a longer format. And then, but then also, I have the debate background, and really caring about thinking about things critically and being nuanced. And then additionally, it was based in a lot of my own personal lived experience to that point, just being a Black woman who lives in the Midwest. I have gay parents, all of these things kind of shapes who I am, and how I kind of like automatically perceive hearing these stories. And then just, of course, like I went through this experience as a victim of a crime that was prosecuted, but, just like any other person, I have other experiences in my life of things that weren't really handled by the criminal legal process, or, like experiences of violence, or just other life experiences that I feel like prepared me to see these stories differently. And
Right.
I felt like that perspective was missing from the true crime genre, in that there just aren't a lot of people that look like me and have life experiences that I have, that are kind of like telling these stories. And I think that there's this great movement towards, victim-centered true crime in the way of like people who maybe are the victims themselves, or victims' family members, telling their own stories, or kind of reshaping the narrative. And I think that's great. And I feel like, being a financial crime victim, I can some of that shapes how I tell stories, but so much of it is honestly the rest of those things that I was going through. And all of that kind of culminated in putting out the first season in the spring of 2021. And that first season was kind of just completely independently produced, just seeing like what I could do. I had no experience podcasting or just like in media at all. But for me, even though I had complained a lot about true crime to my husband and all these things that bothered me about it, it was like
Yeah.
clearly there was something about it that I found really compelling and really interesting, and frankly entertaining. And I think that that's not necessarily a dirty or a bad thing to say. It's like, of course, stories should be entertaining, but it's
Mhm.
also about, of course, what are the takeaways, and how do we kind of bring that story into our actions and real life after we listen to it. So I hopefully that
Yeah.
answered your question, but
No, you did. You are so fascinating, and I would love to be a fly on the wall in your house when you and your husband have discussions. My husband and I are like, "Shut up. No, you shut up." No, I'm just kidding. But really,
that's a little bit what it's like at times.
right? No, it is. You make a great point, because I feel like it's not really worth, and I don't want to say this the wrong way, but I really enjoy nuanced discussions, and I don't think it's fun to have someone on my show discussing a case if we agree, if we are totally on the same page. I want to hear what this person has to say, and I hope they want to hear what I have to say, and hopefully we can back up our claims with evidence and things like that. But I respect so much what you're doing, because I said this at the beginning. I go through these stages where I'm laying in bed and I'm like, if I was the victim of a crime, or if my family was the victim of a crime, a violent crime, let's say, would I want YouTubers, podcasters covering it, giving their opinion on what they think is happening? And I'm like, I'm just not sure. Do you know what I mean? Where I'm like, I don't know if I want all of this out there. And then when I say it out loud, people will reach out to me and say, no, I'd want you to cover it. I'd want you to tell my story. And then it makes me feel a lot better, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I do think what you're doing is really wonderful, because you are so careful and you are so thoughtful about the way that you speak about these crimes. Um, so you just did an episode on Martin Luther King, which I thought was awesome, because you don't necessarily think of, I mean, Martin Luther King, we've learned about him in school since we were how old? I mean, in kindergarten, right? But you don't necessarily think of Martin Luther King as a victim of true crime, but he was. Like, he literally was. So I thought that was brilliant how you worked that into your new season. And then it's followed by the Lauren McCluskey episode, and that case sticks with me because it's one of the most infuriating cases.
Mhm.
If you just want to give, if anyone is not familiar, I would just love for you to give a quick background on that, because I believe that is your most recent episode. Is that right?
Yeah. Oh,
Okay,
yeah, and I'll answer kind of I can talk about a little about both of those episodes.
please.
So we
I'm going to
did
pull up your site right now while you chat about it.
yes. So, the new season of True Crime just premiered on Monday, January 20th, so that was MLK Day. And so we premiered with two episodes. So the Lauren McCluskey episode and the MLK episode both came out that day, and then we're going to be releasing on Mondays, from here on out for the next several months. On Martin Luther, when it comes to the Martin Luther King episode, that episode we did because it of that alignment with MLK Day. One of
Mhm.
the things that I really try to do with episodes on true crime is really balance out the types of stories I'm doing. It was important to me to do episodic true crime, to cover a different case every episode, because I felt like that was the area where I could make the most sort of impact with what I wanted to do, especially when it came
Mhm.
to like nuance, because I feel like if you're talking about an investigative podcast that covers one case over a series of episodes, there's just inherently usually a lot more sort of nuance and criticality. I felt like where some of that was lost is maybe in episodic true crime, where you don't have as much time to spend with every case. And so
Right.
all that said, I try to do lots of different kinds of cases. I think that the MLK case and Lauren McCluskey's story are two very different ones. In the
Mhm.
case of MLK, I like to do stories that like you were saying, people typically think of as just history. They kind of just relegate it to that category, and therefore you're either a history buff and you're kind of into that sort of thing, or
Mhm.
you're not, or you're a true crime girly, right? It's
Right. Right.
two different worlds. And so I kind of felt like, what would it look like to tell stories that are historical or have historical significance, but give them the true crime treatment, right? Tell them in this compelling sort of like format of a true crime story. Um, of course, and especially when I feel like I can give sort of a fresh or unique take. So when it comes to Martin Luther King, what's really interesting about him is, of course, he was a victim of an assassination. So that inherently, it's murder, it's true crime. But
Mhm.
beyond that, there is a unique angle I wanted to explore, which is that most people, honestly, if you ask them what they know about Martin Luther King's assassination, actually, like, were you familiar with the case yourself?
No, not, I mean, honestly, because
Yeah,
I hadn't really dug into it since fourth grade,
right.
I was not.
Yeah. Yeah, and I asked a lot of people in making this episode, like, what they knew about, King's assassination, and people kind of said various things, but, basically no one knew anything detailed.
Mhm.
Some people were like, "Oh, maybe he was killed at a motel." That's true. He was killed at a motel in Memphis, Tennessee. He was out on the balcony of that motel. The motel is called the Lorraine Motel, and then he was shot and killed by a single bullet. And, after that, a man named James Earl Ray was convicted. He pled guilty and was ultimately convicted and sentenced to life in prison for that murder. But what's interesting is that the King family does not believe that James Earl Ray is primarily or even at all responsible for King's assassination. They think that he was a front man, essentially, like he was set up. And they, in 1999, Coretta
Yeah,
Scott King
chill.
alongside her, yeah, it's crazy, right?
Mhm.
Coretta Scott King, alongside her children in 1999, sued a number of groups, including entities of the US government, including like the FBI, and said that they were involved in a conspiracy to kill King. And
You don't learn this in public school.
You
Let me
don't.
tell you that much,
It's
okay?
crazy. Well, nobody and I'm like, "This was 1999." Like, that wasn't that long ago.
Wow.
Obviously, like, King wasn't even killed that long ago. This is all, recent
Right.
history, but especially the civil trial.
Mhm.
And what's actually remarkable is that the King family won the civil trial. So a jury decided that a group of people involving the US government were involved in a conspiracy to kill King. And so to me, it's like this is one of the most sort of like celebrated heroes of, American history. And we don't even barely people don't even know like the official narrative, and they certainly don't know the narrative that the King family and many others support. So I wanted to do an episode that really unpacked that civil trial, the evidence presented during it, and what, here's the official narrative, and then here's the other evidence. There's a lot of sketchy stuff when it comes to this case, that we really dive into. And then you can decide for yourself if you think the government was involved or not. But it's very, very fascinating. And I think, obviously has a lot of importance.
No, I this is crazy because I don't think I realized it was 1999. And I mean, I was listen, I'll just tell you, I think I was in 8th grade in 99. So it is kind of weird that this wasn't a part of our curriculum. It's just a follow-up. It's incredibly interesting. And I actually will tell you that I am not completely against conspiracy theories. I do love facts, but I think being in this space, it has really opened my eyes to things that I'm like, no, that doesn't exist. That would never happen. And then all of a sudden I'm witnessing things with my own eyes in certain trials or, reading certain court filings. I'm like, wait a second, this is insane. It's completely insane, but it's true. So
Yeah.
I'm totally on board with that. And I think that you are brilliant for actually bringing this to light. And more people should hear about this and know about this and this particular episode because again, like you said, nobody covers it and they should. This is a huge part of his story.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I appreciate the kind words. And then that other episode, Lauren McCluskey,
Yes.
extremely different. I think that in many ways, this is a much more typical sort of like true crime story for like, if you listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, this is the kind of story that gets covered a lot.
Right.
Well, Lauren McCluskey was a young woman who was going to college in Utah, and she had started dating this guy that she had met out at a bar, and then, ultimately decided, she was going to end that relationship. She found out some things about his past that were kind of unsettling. He had lied about some details about his life. And
Mm.
then he ended up kind of stalking her and harassing her. And so she started to report this over and over and over again to the local police authority, the campus security, housing officials, and her friends and mom and family were doing the same. And over again, she was essentially brushed off, or kind of told that they would get to it eventually. And
Oh,
she was actually killed by this ex-boyfriend. And and what's interesting too, and really tragic story, but what has come from it that I think is really positive is the work of Lauren's family. They've been so invested in trying to create a future where this kind of thing that happened to Lauren doesn't happen to more people. And I think, and so they started the Lauren McCluskey Foundation, which I recommend folks check out. But also, what I think is interesting about Lauren's story is that Lauren is this, gorgeous young white woman living in Utah. She is very much kind of the typical person that gets covered in true crime media, though she is not necessarily the typical victim if you look at like crime statistics. But I think what's really alarming to me, and I think people should consider, is that we live in a society where all the systems are set up supposedly to protect somebody like Lauren, right? Lauren is sort of the person that you think, all right, yeah, they're going to be looking out for her. But if even Lauren is failed by this system, then you have to imagine that, folks who, maybe indigenous folks, Black women, people who are more likely to be victims of violent crime, are also being failed by this system in large numbers, and maybe their stories aren't getting necessarily as much publicity. And I think that one of the things that Lauren's father said that really stood out to me, we talked about in the episode, is just that, there are so many other young women just like Lauren who are also deeply loved by their parents, right? And whose stories are, need to be out there. So, and I think actually Gabby Petito's parents
I
are
was
kind of
just
doing
gonna
something
say
similar.
that. Yes, I
Yeah.
was like, you should interview them because they are doing that like right now, and it's pretty incredible. And did you see that HBO docuseries Black and Missing? Did you happen to see
Mm-mm.
that?
I haven't.
You should see that. It's really good. I believe it was released in 2021. It's Soledad O'Brien's reporting, and it really highlights everything that you're saying. And truly, when you watch it, I mean, people who are a bit closed-minded might say, "Well, that's not true." Well, you got to watch this, and it is
Mhm.
true. It's
Yeah.
true. I mean, it's like it's if you can't admit that, then you're not looking and you're not paying attention. And
Right.
you're not looking at the actual statistics,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
and of course, I think it's like one of those things where it's like, obviously, what happened to Lauren or Gabby Petito or any young women like them is awful and tragic. This is why, I'm covering a
Of
story
course.
like this, and it's also we do have to, yeah, just be real. If there's statistics and facts and research that back up, the fact that maybe these stories are undercovered, when we're talking about certain victims, I think you just have to sort of acknowledge that and kind of bring that into your framework of how you see the world.
Yeah, I agree. And there's so many missing teens as well. Missing teen minors of color, and their stories aren't covered. I'm
Mm.
so bothered by this one case, Janiyah McMichael. I don't know if you've heard of that case
Mm-mm.
out of Indiana. I mean, she's a 13-year-old, and everything is just so backwards about this case. And what's terrible is that, and if you look into this case, the mom seemingly did not report her 13-year-old missing until school was about to start, because she'd be held accountable somehow. The whole
Mhm.
summer she could get away with maybe her daughter not being around. School's about to start and she's like, "Oh yeah, she's missing." And then all of a sudden you hear from other people, "Wait, we haven't seen her for a couple of
Mm.
months." Well, why did nobody say anything? Why was
Yeah,
nobody like, "Hey, wait a minute?" And so it's really troublesome. And I think again what you're doing is incredible. These stories need to be highlighted, and you're doing it. And the Lauren McCluskey story, I remember when I first saw that on Dateline, I was just like, what? It's those stories where the person should still be alive. And
right.
that is mainly due to other people's shortcomings. And that is just so devastating.
Yeah.
So what else can people expect for Truer Crime season 2? What's coming up?
Yeah, I'm really excited about the stories we're covering because, the rest of them are also like very unique and they have sort of like just unique import, like each one is kind of important for its own reason. So for example, we have a story that is going to be coming out in February about a man who is on death row named DeForest Johnson. He is on death row right now. And so his stakes are quite literally life and death, right? And so, just kind of increasing the awareness and publicity around his case is really important. And I believe that he's innocent. I fully believe that. And I think
Oh,
that that's one of the things that, sometimes with certain cases, wrongful convictions I've covered in the past, it's like, maybe I'm kind of more like, here's the evidence. I'm not really sure where to fall, but here, like where I fall, but regardless of if this person was guilty, they maybe had a really messed up trial or whatever else. In this instance, I do think that DeForest is innocent. And I think when people hear the details of his case, it's shocking what is allowed in legal system. And I think a lot of people, for a lot of people too, like prison is a black hole, right? The story, the true crime story ends at conviction. And I think that, there's a lot that happens in prison that, life goes on, right? That needs to be considered. There's one case I covered in kind of last year. We put out this episode on Sam Mendez, who's a man who was incarcerated in Colorado. He was incarcerated as a teenager under this felony murder law, which basically said that, even if he didn't commit the murder, if it was proven that he was at the scene of the murder, doing some other crime, like perhaps participating in a burglary, then he can also be charged with first degree murder. So that's what
mm.
happened to him.
How old was he?
I can't remember off the top of my head. He's a teenager at the time because he actually, this incident happened and then years passed before he was actually tried, and they like ended up kind of trying to connect it back to him. But they don't have evidence to prove that he killed this woman. And in fact, I don't necessarily think that they think that he did. They just are kind of alleging that he was at the scene of this crime. And so he was convicted. And one of the things that's happened to him since he's been in prison is he has spent most of his time in solitary confinement. And it has led to really, really, really horrifying mental health impacts. He's really lost his sense of reality while in there. And just to think that that could happen to somebody who was a teenager going in. He had like a young son at the time that he was incarcerated too, who is my exact age actually. And so it was kind of just to
Oh,
think of, people don't really engage with or think about, what is the impact when someone enters prison on the people left behind, on the person who is in prison, all of that. So anyways, back to Forrest. He's in prison right now. The stakes are incredibly high for him, and I think that the details around his case are just really, really, really horrifying.
is
Were you
he
gonna?
working with the Innocence Project? Is this
Um,
happening, or is
so he
it?
has
Are
a
you
really
trying to push that?
he has a really great team of lawyers. I think they're
Okay,
from Berkeley, and so he is well represented. And I think his case isn't represented by the Innocence Project, but I think they've really promoted a lot of stuff with him. So I
okay.
think that that's really positive. There's an amazing podcast called Ear Witness by Beth Shelburne, who she's great. Investigative reporter who's been reporting onto Forrest's case for years. And so she was a
Oh,
great resource to me in writing my episode. She covers his case in that podcast, Ear Witness, over a series of episodes. So like after people listen to Truer Crime and kind of like get the gist of it, they can really
right.
deep dive and get any questions answered on that show as well.
Was he convicted before? I'm assuming because this is a lot of these wrongful conviction cases where people are on death row. Is it because they were convicted before DNA evidence was available, and it's like the whole, oh, there's one witness, and this witness was possibly threatened by police, and now here we are, and this guy is in prison because the police needed a conviction? Is it one of those cases?
There's no physical evidence to tie anyone to this murder.
Okay.
It is purely on basically they pursued him on the testimony, well, the statements of one
Yep.
person who has changed their story many, many times. And there's a lot of other sort of contributing factors that I'll get in, listen to the episode to kind of understand
Right.
all the nuances and details. But and then yeah. So it's
Wow.
it's really yeah, there's nothing to say that he did it. There's no physical evidence.
I love that you brought this up because this year was the first year that I participated in some events in New York City around Wrongful Conviction Day. And I guess I had never really dove into these stories. And one of the events I went to, it was about this guy named Ricky Jackson. I don't know if you've heard about him, but he was actually the longest wrongfully incarcerated person on death row.
Wow.
And yeah, this was in Ohio. And
Mhm.
they premiered a film called Lovely Jackson. And it was about his story. And Ricky was there. And Celicia, after this film, I was sobbing. I'm a huge baby. I was completely sobbing, actually, to the point where I was almost hyperventilating here. Okay. And then the producer gets up and Ricky gets up and they're like, okay, we're going to go have drinks and celebrate the evening. And I'm like, I need a minute. Like, what is going on?
Yeah.
I felt like it was just so bizarre to me, I guess, because I was so moved and I was so destroyed by this. I mean, I was destroyed.
Yeah.
This guy was wrongfully incarcerated for 35 years and now everybody wants to go have drinks,
Yeah.
including, Ricky Jackson. And I met him and I hugged him and it's almost like you don't know what to say. And I said, I was sorry for what you went through because I was. And he was like, don't be sorry for me. He's like, I'm fine. I'm happy. I mean, and the term or the movie title, Lovely Jackson, it was about, he named his daughter Lovely Jackson. He
Mhm.
became a father at age 60 for the first time on Father's Day, I believe in
Wow.
2020 or something like that. And it was so moving because, and sorry, I'm rambling about this because I just was so affected by it. He said
Yeah.
he would lay in his bed at night, and I'm going to cry. But what would keep him going was like dreaming that he would have a family one day. And so
Yeah.
I was just like, oh my gosh. And his story, the Innocence Project had tried so hard to get this witness to recant their statement. And this witness, let me tell you, he was definitely bullied by the police to say this, but this witness, I mean, his life was destroyed. He knew
Mhm.
what he did. He knew what
Mhm.
he did to Ricky Jackson. He was completely destroyed by this. And it took actually Ricky meeting with him and saying, I forgive you. I forgive you. It's okay. Don't worry. And I felt like even this witness, who's 60 now, he can finally start his life. So
Yeah.
it's a horrible, horrible process, and it's a horrible ordeal for obviously for the wrongfully convicted person. But
Yeah.
let me tell you, everybody involved is affected.
Definitely.
Yeah,
Definitely. I'll have to check that out.
you should. It's like it's the craziest thing, and it was just God, it was so moving.
Yeah.
But and another, it's funny, another mom at one of my kids' school, she's an attorney, but she travels and I don't know what it's called, and you might know. She actually helps inmates with. She's not a prison rep because she's an attorney, but she helps them just know their rights, I guess, if that makes
Okay.
sense. Like
Yeah,
so,
yeah, yeah.
if
Like a
yeah,
legal
like if
aid kind of.
right, if he's being in solitary for no reason, she would step in and be like, "What the hell's going on?" Which
Yeah.
someone probably should have done for Richard Allen. But I'm from Delphi, but yeah, like he should have had someone step in and be like, "Wait a minute, this is not right."
Yeah. There's
But
been a
anyway,
lot of really crazy death row or like wrongful conviction cases coming out of Ohio in particular. There's I don't know if you've heard of Keith Lamar. This is a story that we're not covering in this season of True Crime, but I am talking to him and hopefully we'll be able to put out a story about him. But he's on death row in Ohio, and it's another case. This is a very, very interesting case. He was in prison when he got put on death row because he was in prison for a different reason. He had been involved with drugs and had kind of like somebody had tried to rob him. There was a shootout, and that person then ended up being killed. So
mm,
Keith went to prison for that. He pled guilty and he was convicted on those murder charges. Once he was in prison, though, there was a riot at this prison in Ohio, and they took over the prison. It's like tied for like the longest prison riot in
oh,
American history. And a guard was killed, and then several prisoners were killed. And afterwards, they really needed to pin this on some people. Somebody had to sort of have accountability or take accountability for this. And the conditions in the prison were quite terrible, right? So this is
mm,
a whole there's a lot of nuances into why did this prison riot happen and all of that. But anyways, Keith was convicted of killing multiple people during the riot, and the trial that he had while he was, like this death row trial he had was just egregious. Like there's so many issues in the investigation of this riot, and then the
mhm,
prosecution of him and the other people who were ultimately convicted on with other deaths. He was also kind of just like they pinned masterminding the riot on him, and there's not a lot of evidence to support that. So really interesting story. And Keith, but my point, I guess, that I wanted to get to was that Keith is an amazing person. I've talked to him multiple times and kind of trying to like learn more about his case and story. I mean, he started a nonprofit. He works with, virtually with kids, with teenagers, doing
wow,
reading and book clubs. And yeah, he created an album where his words and writing is like, he collaborated with all these jazz artists, and it's been put out.
wow.
Really, really cool person. He
What
reads a
what was
ton.
he in prison for in the first place? Just
Well,
curious.
that was for that he was a drug dealer, and then they had tried to rob him, and then there was this shootout, and so one of the people who was trying to rob him was killed, so he was convicted for the murder
Okay,
of that
got
guy.
it.
And so, but he pled guilty to that. That's what's interesting is like Keith pled guilty to that. And when it came to this case, he says he didn't do it. And
Right.
so, but I think what's really interesting about Keith and the person he is that it just really demonstrates that people in prison aren't just sort of like, I think the stereotype that a lot of people have.
Mhm.
And I mean, even though I do think that there's a lot of reforms that our prison system needs, in the case of Keith and some other
Yeah,
people I've spoken with, prison can be a transformative experience if they want it to be. It's really not necessarily about the services the prison is providing because it's often
right.
terrible, but like
Mhm.
Keith has been dedicated to his own self-development. So he's just a really very cool person. There's tons about him out on the internet, so people can look him up. He has a website, and he's had op-eds published in major publications. I think when the pandemic
Wow.
happened, he did an op-ed about like, I live on death row, and which is solitary confinement. And so I here's what some tips I can give to people experiencing isolation during the beginning of the pandemic from my perspective on death row. So
That's wild. Wow.
yeah.
I'll have to look that up. I mean, this all sounds so compelling. I'm so grateful that you came on the show, honestly. And I have to say, I feel like you should think about law school one day and just being no, seriously, and being a lawyer for the Innocence Project. You seem to have a lot of passion for this stuff, and you're clearly really intelligent, probably too intelligent for a lot of you really are. I mean, it's really impressive. So I think you should consider that. I mean, it's just my opinion. Take it for what it is, but I have a feeling you've probably heard that before.
Yes, every debate kid always thinks about being a lawyer. But I do
Yeah.
like telling stories, and I think too. I mean, we obviously talked about wrongful convictions, but I do just want to kind of throw out what other things people might be able to expect quickly if they do listen, which is
Okay.
just that's one type of case we cover, but we're also
Mhm.
going to cover some other things that are the kind of across the spectrum. For example, we're going to be covering the Manson murders in a 2-part episode.
Cool.
Again, this is a story, an infamous story. In season 1, I covered Jonestown, another infamous story, but there was a twist on it. Here's the things you don't know about Jonestown, kind of similar to the MLK story that we were talking about earlier. So I think a lot of people don't know that. Manson was trying to incite a race war, that he actually tried to pin these crimes that he and his family committed on the Black Panther. So there's a lot of really interesting
Mhm.
details in that story. And then, of course, we're covering some more stories of, victims who were targeted by maybe unexpected perpetrators.
Right.
And then cases where, I think we have things to learn. There's a case that we're covering about a man named Timothy Coggins, whose murder was unsolved for like 30, I think it was 30 plus years. And it was just
Wow.
solved a few years ago. And so just, I think there's a lot to be taken that we can learn from his story in our current cultural moment. But
Mhm.
all that to say, I think that anybody who's a fan of true crime could find cases that we're covering that kind of are the type that they normally like to dig into.
Yeah, and I think it's wonderful that, you do focus on the social injustices, but you're not sitting here not covering a horrific crime against a blonde girl with blue eyes. I mean, you said it yourself. You're not like that. So you're not only going towards one area of crime. So I do think that's also just really cool of you.
Yeah,
So
and
yeah.
for me, I always felt like I never wanted True Crime to be the social justice podcast. I didn't want it to be
Mhm.
the history podcast or the
Yes.
podcast with a black host. I wanted it to be a true crime podcast. You know what I
Yes.
mean? Like I wanted to fit firmly within the genre. And so
Yes.
to me, that's not just like showing like, to me, giving doing ethical true crime, if you want to call it that. I don't, not the best phrasing, but like doing ethical true crime isn't just about telling stories that are like, about people who are
Mhm.
typically underrepresented. It's about telling real stories of crime in a nuanced way that allows us to really ask critical questions. So I appreciate that feedback.
No, it's awesome. I'm really excited. I think you do such a good job. I mean, I encourage everyone to listen to your shows, and hopefully after hearing you speak on this show, people will be running because you are just so well spoken, so intelligent and really passionate. So, I want to thank you again,
Yeah, thank
Celisia
you so much.
Stanton, of course, of Tenderfoot TV's Truer Crime. I will have all of her information, her socials, her website in the episode notes so you guys know where to find her. Thank you again for joining me, and I hope that you'll consider coming back sometime.
Yeah, this was great. I love it. I feel like in promoting kind of the episodes we're covering in season 1, I've gotten to talk to lots of different creators, but I felt like we got to talk about some unique questions that I haven't really gotten to explore yet. So I really appreciate it.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. All right, everyone, stay safe and stay vigilant. Thanks for listening.